And Professor Dutton, from what I understand, since you started in the 70s, your views have changed considerably over what the basic nature of domestic violence is. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that would be a fair assessment, although I will say I never completely bought into the gender explanation of domestic violence, even in the early days.
So you were questioning it from the beginning, and for you the early days would be, what, the mid-70s?
Yeah, really. I mean, I was interested in it as a psychological phenomenon, not really as a socio-political phenomenon, which is the way it's cast by the gender paradigm.
I just wanted to say, Don, well, to me, obviously, because I'm not an academic and I have no degrees, all I have is sort of street experience. So when I took in the first women, the first 100 that came in, we sat down and did questionnaires together. And of the first 100 that came in, 62 were violent or more violent than the men they left.
Right.
What was left were women who were innocent victims of their partner's violence. They hadn't come from violent backgrounds. They, by accident, had got involved with a violent man.
Right.
The women that most mattered, and the women that I, in the end, took care of, were the women who had actually histories of violence in their own backgrounds. And they were the ones that were violent to the men, to the children, and repeat violent relationships. So I, from the very beginning, stopped worrying about the figures of how many men hit, how many women hit. The question is, how many and what happened to you as a child? And if you were born and marinated in violence in the womb and then born into a violent family, you will devolve strategies of survival, I used to call it. And many, the only strategy they ever learn in those families is violence. So they go on to repeat patterns. So all the other arguments actually fall by the wayside because we've got to stop the war, the gender war, because until we stop it, we can't heal it.
Right. Well, I mean, yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, and of course, the research evidence doesn't support the gender paradigm at all. It's only a very small percentage of men or women in any society that's been sampled, i.e. Western societies, that approve of using violence to hit their partner. It's like 2% in the U.S. of men and 1.8% of women. So there's no acceptance for this at all. Secondly, if you look within any demographic group, it could be any racial group or socioeconomic group or whatever, it's only somewhere around 12% at most of people in that group who've ever used domestic violence. So you're always looking at a minority of every demographic group. And if you're finding a minority coming up all the time, then there's got to be other factors going on, more of a sort of psychological nature that probably have origins in the family of origin, the way you described it, that differentiates that small group who's using it from the larger group who doesn't use it within that demographic category.
You know, John, I was particularly interested in talking to you because when I last saw you, we were with Senator Ann Cools, and she was running a refuge in the very early days.
Yes.
My mother was Canadian, and she was violent and abused as a child. And I particularly wanted to ask you about the history, because if I got this right, that the reason why Canada, of all countries in the world that I've been to, the Western world particularly, is the most frightening in terms of the feminist, what would you call it, the rule of the feminist fist in a country like yours, to where they've created new criminal offenses, and they've expanded any kind of sexual behavior to where virtually your universities are hostile places towards young men. How did all this begin? How did they get that power? How did they get funded to have so much?
Well, it was a matter of sort of influence, I guess, in the early days and how things developed sort of socioeconomically. I mean, there were a number of sort of strange events that happened here. For example, when domestic violence as a problem was first offered up in the House of Commons, the media sort of portrayed the fact that, quote, some honorable members were laughing. Well, we don't know what they were laughing about, but that sort of really hit the fan, and how could these guys be laughing at domestic violence? And it just kind of, I don't know why it came through more strongly in Canada, but it was an issue, and the way it was sort of portrayed, of course, is domestic violence equals women's rights. So that really appealed to the left. And then to the right, it was, well, domestic violence really equals family values. It really appealed to the right. So there was no opposition, just no opposition. Anybody who would say anything about the gender paradigm was somehow labeled as being anti-female or in favor of domestic violence. Some ridiculous argument would be made. I mean, I still get that. I get that in academic papers where people criticize me for being against women's rights because I talk about what the data say. I mean, I don't know why Canada is more extreme, but it's pretty extreme. You're right.
Well, I
mean, I think it's a comment on how twisted things have become, that you're labeled a radical if you're showing people what the data say, and i.e. what the empirical evidence says. But when that becomes a radical position, then you know we're in trouble.
But you see, one of the problems is where you have President Obama, who is a feminist, from what he says, and our Prime Minister, who also calls single-parent mothers honourable and men feckless.
David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, who's a conservative, by the way, a Tory, also recently declared himself a feminist, in case anybody cares. Go on there, Erin.
I was just going to say, when it's at the top echelons, and it's certainly true of America, essentially will not take any action against the lies and the tragedies that have happened because of the lies, and the state of young men in their countries, the state of fathers who've been dragged out illegally from their homes, the fact that men have lost their human right to be innocent before they're proven guilty. This is all going on a daily basis. But nobody seems to be caring up in any of the positions of power, because all of them, to be honest, they're frightened of the radical feminists. They're frightened of the power of the vote of these women. That's what I think.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that somehow the simplistic notion has carried the day that domestic violence is equivalent to an assault on women's rights. And so anybody who moves in any way to make a domestic violence program more sophisticated, even to move it up a level to, let's see what the data say, is sort of automatically lambasted as being against women's rights. And as I said, I mean, I've had academics come out in print and say I was against women's rights because I was talking about what the data said of domestic violence. So long as we've got that simplistic thinking, it's pretty hard to make any headway.
What we need to do is to continue to do what we're doing to bring information to the public. I, too, have been attacked tremendously. In fact, recently at one of our events, people have wished me to be boiled in acid and burnt in a fire because I just simply stated that men and boys are in crisis. And the good thing is, I was at a store just the other day. A young 17-year-old boy came up to me. He said, "Are you Attila Vincer?" I said, "Yes." And I was wondering how he knew me. He said, "I was at the Queen's Park rally, and I brought my mother there, and I was so shocked, and it was unbelievable the information that you guys put forward." So one, the fact that we're talking about it is effective, and we need to continue to bring this information to our members of Parliament. We need to bring this information to the media, and I will tell you in the short 8-year period that I've been advocating for the rights of children and families, I have seen a change. I am seeing media actually reporting and taking some risk in reporting. I will tell you that years ago they refused to even talk about it because they would be immediately attacked by these feminists. And why are they attacking? They are attacking because by actually acknowledging the truth about domestic violence, we are taking away 50% of their potential funding.
No, I mean, a system that's failing on a conceptual level is failing everybody. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, in fact, even studies that they've done, even if you just focus on violence to women as the sole objective of policy, things that like mandatory arrest just don't really do the trick the way they're currently set up. I mean, in U.S. states, the states that have mandatory arrest have higher spousal homicide rates towards women than the ones that didn't set up mandatory arrest. And one of the reasons some women stopped using the system because they didn't want their husband to be arrested. They just didn't like that. So, it's failing women and it fails men, obviously. Everybody gets failed by it because it's misconceptualized.
And at the end of the day, the real victims of all this are the children, because they are born into these families, and they have, at least the adults had a choice of each other, even if it was a bad choice. But the children have no choice. They're born in, and essentially the only recourse, because there is no treatment, a proper treatment program for either men or women. There's only this dreadful Duluth model, which is all to do with the patriarchy, and men have to confess and admit that they have a Y chromosome. The real treatment model has to be that these are already hideously battered children who have just grown up to repeat the pattern, and they need help to transcend their own violence. And that's what I did all those years and still do, because it's in the transcending that you make the change.
And how much more common it is for women to sexually assault men than anybody wants to hear or wants to believe. Very much like the domestic violence issue. People don't want to believe women sexually assault at a higher rate than the media and the government usually reports. And he's also got solid academic peer-reviewed research behind him. I assume that's not an area of research you get into much, Professor Dutton?
I've read the literature on it. I haven't done research on it myself. And when we did our research on the abuse of personality, and we used as criterion measures in this research the reports of wives who were partnered with men that were in a criminal justice system treatment group. And so we asked them all about psychological abuse and sexual abuse and physical abuse, and the reports of sexual abuse in that group were actually so low that it was pointless to even try to report them.
Wow. That's just amazing. Well, I mean, I think the point I was trying to get at earlier, we probably want to start wrapping up the show here in a little bit, but I'm actually really hopeful when I hear that even though there is a growing female, if not dominance, and certainly majority in the psychological field, if these young women coming up are showing themselves able to be open-minded and thoughtful and not reactionary, then, well, I mean, there's this old phrase, I don't remember who said it, was a physicist, Niels Bohr, or one of those guys said, science advances one funeral at a time. It may be that there's a great deal of hope coming up in this crop of young researchers, young up-and-coming psychologists who will hear it and will believe it and don't have a vested interest in not believing that the gender paradigm is bunk. Because the gender paradigm, from all the science I can see, from all the real-world experience I can see, the gender paradigm is nonsense. And we don't have a problem with men's violence toward women. We have a problem with people's violence toward each other.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And the whole of the gender paradigm actually ends up as a very serious fraudulent use of taxpayers' money to keep this evil empire, as I call it, alive.
I would agree.
Well, excellent. So let's go ahead and start wrapping up the show.